I think this last summer, I sensed that there was a sort of an unease in Iowa City. People were watching the rivers. People were watching the Iowa River, the Cedar River, the Des Moines, all big rivers with big watersheds that had the potential of producing big floods. All of them were flowing pretty much at bank level through much of the summer. And if you combine that flowing at bank level with some of the statistics, some of the information we now have, for example, every year for the last 20 years, Iowa has had a presidential declaration for floods, one county or more, every year for the last 20 years. The floods of 2008 were our largest natural disaster ever in Iowa. And in recent years, Iowa has had the third most expensive damage, the third largest damage from flooding of any state in the Union. We're third after, guess what? Mississippi, Alabama, Iowa. Flooding is a big deal in Iowa. We've heard it in the newspaper. Flooding is the new norm, the new normal. People seem to be adjusting very rapidly to the fact that we're going to continue to flood. The National Weather Service this last summer predicted that we would have flooding that was the most severe we have ever had here. The flood predictions were more extreme than any previous flood years. Using the same computer models, they were more extreme even than 2008. We simply lucked out this last summer. We lucked out because we didn't have those intense rains falling in the watershed in just the right area at just the right place. Other places in Iowa didn't have such a lucky year. 2010 was indeed a flood year for Iowa. Rivers in central Iowa and western Iowa, several cities there had the largest floods they've ever had on record. So we don't know what the total damage is yet, but we know that it was another flood year. So we look at 1993, 2008, 2010. We look at the weather predictions, the climate change predictions, and we say, what exactly is happening in Iowa? I'm not sure I can tell you this, but I can tell you that the publication of this book, Watershed Year, was quite amazing. It was published in March of this year, 3 months before people started to think about 2010 as being another severe flood year. And as a result of that, I think out of fear, there's been quite a bit of interest in the book. And there have been flood symposia that have been organized by the Regents institutions and by other organizations like the Rebuild Iowa office and NRCS and other offices across the state. We've had 7 so far. By a few weeks from now, we will have had 10 flood symposia across the state going to different communities, speakers from the Regents institutions going and telling people about flooding and trying to discuss flooding with them and what can you do to get ready for the future. How can people think differently? How can people learn to live with floods, if indeed that's the prediction in the future for Iowa? I learned a lot by doing this book. I'm not a flood expert by any means. I'm an ecologist by training. So I learned a lot. When I did the book, I thought that I was done once I finished the book. And I'll tell you, I've learned as much probably in the last 6 months, which feels like 6 years to me, as much in the last 6 months as I did doing the book itself. So what I'd like to do tonight is do a talk that I couldn't have done when the book first came out and Sarah first called me. I couldn't have done this 6 months ago because I didn't know what I know now. But I'd like to combine the kinds of research that we're doing on climate change, what we're figuring out about climate change, with information on landscape alteration, and also looking at the science of flooding itself, which is a very complex subject, and combine those topics in my talk tonight. So first, before I start, just a very brief introduction to Watershed Year. If you haven't looked at it, I think that anyone in this room would enjoy looking at it. It's a book that is written for the landscape managers and policymakers and the like, but it's really a book written for the general public. Short chapters, lots of graphics. It's my ideal of writing is you read a chapter kind of like a hot knife slipping through butter without any work whatsoever, and people have told me that they can read this late at night. Even my son said that he stayed up late reading it. That was, I think, about the nicest compliment I've ever gotten from any of my kids about anything. So it's a book that's accessible. It's quite diverse. There are 25 chapters in it covering a diversity of subjects, but all relating to the science of the floods of 2008. However, it's not limited to that flooding. It could have easily been titled Flooding in the Corn Belt, because the floods across the Corn Belt have certain traits, and those are the traits that are discussed in this book. So let's talk about floods in Iowa. If we talk about floods in Iowa, we really need to begin with talking about the tallgrass prairie ecosystem. This is the ecosystem that covered 80% of Iowa for about the last 9,000 years in some areas of Iowa. This is the ecosystem that produced 25% of the world's grade A topsoils. That's what Iowa has. We are truly blessed in terms of the soils that we have. 25% of the best topsoils in the world right here, thanks to this tall grass prairie. And the prairie was a miracle in terms of what it did for the land. In terms of ecosystem services, the ecosystem services are the things that nature gives us. Nature gives us every day without us saying please or thank you. The tallgrass prairie gave us many things, biodiversity, clean air, clean water, lots and lots of different things, but in particular our soils, the soils that define our culture and our economy. But the prairie was really the gold standard of water management services. The prairie managed water like no other ecosystem, I think, on this continent could have done, both in terms of water retention, hanging on to the water. The prairie was kind of like a magnet, a greedy, set of greedy hands that didn't want to let the water loose. It held on to it in a big way, and that meant flood resistance. You've probably heard that prairies were like a gigantic sponge. And also in terms of water purification. The waters of Iowa ran crystalline clear prior to settlement. There was no, water pollution did not exist. And you can understand that if we just very briefly trace a water droplet from that, let's trace a bunch of water. Let's trace a rainstorm falling on those prairie grasses and forbs, prairie flowers. A lot of the water would have fallen on the plants, and before it even got down to the ground surface, it would have evaporated back into the sky. If it did get down to the ground surface, it wouldn't have been able to run over the surface the way water does now, because the thatch covering the ground surface was so very thick. The relatively small amount of water that got into the soil was held by the soil. It was held by an average of 16 inches across the state. That's average, 16 inches of topsoil. That was half air. It was indeed like a big sponge. And the amount of air the amount of kind of air bubbles in the soil meant that the prairie could hold tremendous amounts of water. And if some of the water happened to trickle through the soil, it did so very slowly, very reluctantly, and it eventually came out in seeps in the valley bottoms. A lot of the valleys didn't have actual rivers, they just had these slow-moving seeps. So crystalline clear water, not a whole lot of flooding, not a whole lot of shedding of water once the rainstorm fell onto the land. This changed very rapidly. We have a little bit of a problem here in that the bottom line is cut off, but that's okay. I can read it to you, no problem. The prairie was transformed into our agricultural landscape. It was a rapid landscape transformation, and in this transformation, many of the prairie's ecosystem services were decreased or lost. This transformation from one of the most complex and diverse ecosystems, biomes in the country, on the continent, to one of the most highly engineered landscapes has been called the most rapid and complete ecological transformation in the history of the Earth. It happened in less than a single generation. And today what we have is 2/3 of Iowa being covered by 2 species rather than the 1,000 species of plants, many thousands of species of plants and animals of the prairie. We have 2/3 of Iowa being covered, farmers hope, by 2 species, corn and soybeans. The kind of dark gray patchwork quilt up there is an aerial photo of Pocahontas County, where something like 92% of the land surface is covered by corn and soybeans, and the rest is just this patchwork of roads and a few little homesteads here and there. So what you have as a result of this transformation is a modern hydrology that's totally altered from its original state, and the land now, instead of infiltrating, instead of restraining water, the land is engineered to shed water so that people can grow crops, which is why we're here. How is that done? I mean, what I'm trying to say is that I'm not blaming the original farmers, but I think we've gone a little bit too far. That's the main theme that I've written about in my books, and it's what I firmly believe. This is done by tiling the land. Tiles, do all of you know, does anybody know what a tile is? A few people. Okay, most of you do. So I won't explain them. I won't explain that the tiles have these perforations and the water comes down, collects in these pipes. It's always seemed kind of like a miracle to me that the water happens to find these little holes in the plastic pipes, but it does, and it's shed rapidly into ditches, which are dug into the ground to accept these ditches. This started in about the 1870s. We're still doing a lot of tiling today, an immense amount of tiling, actually, if you drive through the countryside. And about a third of Iowa cropland is now tiled, which means that water that goes into the soil, instead of moving very slowly and reluctantly, is shot extremely rapidly into the nearest drainage, which means if you have a lot of rain, a lot of water coming in, that drainage goes up and down, and we have flashy streams. But also, at some point, the tiles are running full. And people say, well, the tiles caused the floods of 2008. And what I've been told is, no, that's not true, because the tiles had been running full all spring. You know, they had been shooting all this water in, which is why the streams were running at or above bank level already when we had our big floods. At that point, the water cannot get into the soil. The soil is saturated, and it runs off the surface. And that means that during this time when the soil is saturated, we have tremendous erosion, and almost incredible. In 2008, we had in some sites 50 tons of acre per day. Now, these are selected sites. This is a few sites, but it did happen. The maximum allowable erosion for Iowa is supposed to be 5 tons per acre per year. So we had in one day 10 times as much as you're supposed to have in the entire year. And that means that you don't only have silt running into the drainages, but you also have a flush of pollution, nitrates and phosphates going into the Gulf of Mexico, causing the dead zone down there. And what is the result of all of this? Shedding of water, this engineered landscape. Well, the result of landscape alteration, if we look at the Raccoon River, which regularly floods Des Moines, right? That's what causes Des Moines floods, one of the two rivers, is an increase in annual river discharge. And this has been traced in rivers across Iowa. If you look at the discharge here, if I can find my pen, here it is. You can see that we started out in 1927 with an annual discharge average annual discharge below 1,000 cubic feet per second, and now we are up around 2,000 cubic feet per second average annual discharge in one river, meaning that river now carries twice as much water, a little bit more than twice, on average every year. And this is interesting because this was done by Mike Burkhardt at Iowa State University. You can see that the annual average discharge has gone up, and it goes up parallel with the increase in percent annual crop coverage in the Raccoon River watershed. So you'd say, well, no brainer, right? They're cause and effect. Well, as many of you know, they're correlated, but correlation does not mean causation. This is indeed one of the reasons that we have more flooding in Iowa. I don't think anybody would dispute the fact that landscape alteration has led to more intense flooding, but it's not the only reason. Let's see, we can say increase is partially due to landscape changes, but I'm going to say we have to look a little bit further than that, and I'll get there soon. Landscape transformation has also resulted in more runoff in cities. When you have natural ground cover, you have about 10% of the water running off on average, and half of it infiltrating the soil. In today's highly developed cities, you have that flip-flopped with over half of the water running off and about 15% infiltration. But the thing is, in Iowa, this isn't that big of a deal because we just don't have that much ground covered by cities. It's a factor, something to be concerned about, but not in Iowa in a major, major way in terms of flooding. So what can we say about floods? Well, we can say in response to landscape transformation, we've had the character of floods changing greatly. Nobody disputes now that floods are faster, they're flashier, up, down, and the size, the peaks are higher. They come up higher than they used to because the water is going way up and it goes way out of the banks before it goes back down. Are floods more frequent? A lot of people would like to say that, and all we can say is that floods may be more frequent. We just don't have, we have flood records from about the 1880s or so. For some drainages, for some a lot less than that. And so we can say they may be, but we don't have enough statistical information to say that that is true. It would make sense that they're more frequent, but we don't know for sure. But landscape transformation is not the whole story. Here is Iowa City's flood record, and here's the flood of 2008, 41,000 cubic feet per second running through the Iowa City. Look over here in 1851, 70,000 cubic feet per second, a flood that was almost twice as big. That is when much of the landscape was still prairie. We also had a bigger flood in 1918, in 1881. It's natural that we had floods because floods are what rivers do. Floodplains have evolved to hold the water that cannot be held in a river's banks at certain times when the water is excessive. And the water is excessive. If you have a huge dump of water on the landscape, even the prairie couldn't hold it. And so you did have floods before we had all the prairie plowed. You can't say that landscape transformation is not the entire story, just part of it. So you have to say, well, what about Iowa's floods? What are they like? When do we flood and why? So let's take a look at this graph. A lot of these graphs are from the book Watershed Year, and they're very nicely explained by the authors, I have to say. They did a good job. And if you look at the floods in Iowa, you can see we have two flood peaks, one in early spring and one in June, a little bit less in July. This makes sense to us. This is when we've had our floods the last couple years. The same processes were in effect in both 2008 and 2010. And those processes were that in early spring you have flooding from one of two things, either rain falling on frozen ground or a rapid snowmelt. And in June you have flooding from this wave of thunderstorms that kind of comes through Iowa. Sometimes the thunderstorms get held up, kind of move very slowly across the state, and big dumps of water in early June. And what happened in 2008 and 2010, well, we had a certain pattern that was set up, and this is a pattern that we need to watch for in the future because this seems to be a trend. And so we can't say that we can prove anything about flooding and climate change or whatever, but we can say that there's a trend, which is this: snowy winter, cold snowy winter, runoff in the spring, flooding, minor flooding in the spring when the snow melts, but a cool spring so that you don't have a lot of evaporation from this runoff. The snow melts, the riverbanks rise up to their top, flood a little bit, go back down, but because of the coolness, the soil stays moist, again, because you don't have a lot of evaporation. And maybe, as in 2008, the farmers couldn't get the crops in very early, meaning that you don't have any plants in the ground to pull that water out of the soil and release it through transpiration back into the atmosphere. So that when you have a big dump of water later in the spring, you have flooding. That's what's happened in Iowa across the flood record. It happened in a big way both this year and in 2008. The thing is, what do we know now that's happening? Well, we know one thing very strongly, that Iowa is changing, Iowa is getting wetter. And we have a lot of information which is statistically significant on this, and this I've gotten from the Iowa State University Climate Science Program, which is looking at all of these trends, all of these changes, and trying to make sense of them. So what do we know about Iowa getting wetter? We know that we have wetter years. We have an increase in the number of years with rainfall exceeding 40 inches. The average rainfall in Iowa is still around, the average across the state is still around about 36 inches per year. We have more and more years where it's going above 40 inches. More and more years, we have an annual precipitation which is now about 10% greater than it was in the 1940s. So if the average was 30 inches in the 1940s, the average now is 33 inches, for example. And we know that in the historical record from about the late 1800s, Cedar Rapids' annual average rainfall has increased from 28 to 37 inches per year. Definitely more precipitation than it used to be, tremendously more. We know that we have an increase in the number of days with rainfall exceeding or equaling 1.25 inches, which is a pretty heavy rainfall. You know, if you have more than 1¼ inches, That's a big deal. We also have a statistically significant increase of days where we have more than 4 inches of rainfall. So all of these categories are being exceeded. We know that since the 1940s, the average stream flow in Iowa, in streams across the state, has increased about 20 to 50%. We have an increasing number of high flow days in central Iowa and an increasing number of extreme flow days. And we know that the spring soil moisture is near saturation more frequently. Why is that important? That's important because when you get these big dumps then in early summer, you can't get the water entering the soil. And that the rainfall is shifting to spring and early summer over the last 30 years. Now remember, spring and early summer are the times of the year that we have flooding. So proportionally more of the year's rainfall comes during the flood season than it used to. And we know that increasing precipitation leads to proportionally more stream flow. 20% increase in precipitation, which some people predict by 2050, would lead to a 50% increase in stream flow. Why is that? Because once the soil is saturated, the water doesn't have any place to go but right down the hill into the stream. So if we're at kind of a level now where the soil can handle the water, that is going to be not enough in the future. The more rain that we get, that rain is going to go right into the streams and lead to bigger and more flooding. Here's a graph showing that we've had more wet years since 1950. Here's the total annual statewide average precipitation. 1873 was around 32 inches per year. Now it's about 34. I said it was 36. I was wrong. But you've seen, you can see also that people look and say this is statistically significant, that the wet years are more common than they were in the past. Now, how does this relate to climate change? This is the question that I think is on everybody's mind. And the one thing, the one fact that people have pointed to, which is, again, statistically significant, is that, here and I'll quote, one of the clearest trends in the United States observational record is an increasing frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events. This trend is statistically significant. This was published in 2008, June 2008, right when we were getting ours. And you can see that in our part of the country, we have 31% more extreme precipitation events than we used to. Look here at New England. They've got 67% more extreme precipitation. Really a lot. Down here in the Southwest, it's only 9%. But this is happening across the country. Bigger, more extreme rainfalls. And notice also you have that coalescing right when you get the rainfall shifting to the spring. You also get an increase in extreme events, both of which kind of complement each other in terms of flooding. So this doesn't look real good. Excuse this drawing down here. I couldn't figure out how to get those little arrows to disappear. But we can say what is causing heavy rainfall events. And we can, one thing we can say about climate change is that we do know that there is more water vapor in the air over the Midwest, which is the result of, in part, of a warmer Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean. More greenhouse gases have created warmer oceans. The temperature of the ocean has risen around the world about 1 degree Fahrenheit, if I remember correctly. And that means that there's more water vapor coming off of the Gulf of Mexico. And you may know that much of our precipitation, much of our water vapor is swept up in the summer. This kind of hot, muggy weather is moisture that's being swept up from the Gulf of Mexico. So as the Gulf water vapor has increased, we've gotten more moisture over Iowa, and if you have more moisture in the air, that means you have more rainfall. We also know that there's a certain Pacific temperature pattern that now diminishes drought because of the way it's channeling the storms. But another thing we know is that across the nation, an increase in agricultural production and irrigation also leads to more moisture in the atmosphere. And that wet soils breed more rainfall, which breed more wet soils, and it just goes around. It's a self-perpetuating cycle. So, is this climate change or not? Well, in part. I mean, this increase in water vapor is certainly related to an increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But we can't say that all of the change, again, is related either to climate change or to landscape alteration. And so you say, well, what should you do? You know, I have people saying, well, you know, if we don't know about it, it doesn't exist. But what people in general say is that we don't know if it's due to climate change, but the changes that are occurring now and the patterns that we're seeing are consistent with what the models predict. And that it could be due to climate change. It makes a lot of sense. And since we don't know, the better part of valor, or the wise thing to do, is to prepare for a changing climate when we will indeed have these as ongoing trends because of, again, climate change. So in summary from the Iowa State Climate Science Program, what does the future hold? They say in the next 10 years, similar rainfall to what we've already had. Not an increase because of the specific weather pattern that's now dominating. The next 20 years, days with heavy rainfall will be mixed with drier periods as you have this Pacific pattern supposedly dissipating. And after that, days of heavier rainfall increasing in stream flow 20% or more. So we can say climate change, landscape alteration, but even that does not totally totally explain the floods of 2008, which was caused by what many people have called a perfect storm of conditions, and I'll just explain this very rapidly. This is some exciting work that's going on at my home institute, IHR Hydroscience and Engineering, where people are looking at the timing of water. And what you can do now with NextRad data, which came in the early 1990s, the NextRad data gave us the ability to look at exactly when rainfall is falling over a certain piece of land. So we can, for the first time ever, say, okay, there's this much rainfall falling on this amount of land, and then you can couple that with computer models that give you the ability to time the water flowing into the nearest stream and into the nearest drainage and down to the Mississippi. So you can kind of say, okay, rainfall, 20 miles north of here today, by tomorrow night, we're going to have an increase in the Iowa River of so-and-so inches. It's pretty cool stuff. And here, look at this map, for example. You can say, okay, any water here will flow through Cedar Rapids the next day. That's 1 day. 2 days out, 3 days out, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days. If you have a storm up here and you have 5 inches of rain, you know that that 5-inch rainfall is going to be hitting Cedar Rapids 5 days later. If you couple that with the NextRad generated maps, you can explain this flood of Cedar Rapids, which was so huge. Here is the day, June 13th, is the day that Cedar Rapids had the biggest flood, right? Completely clear, no precipitation at all. But the night before, they had a heavy rain in the 1 day before, 1 day short shy of Cedar Rapids area, right? Red, a lot of rain. And then they had 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, 4 day, 5 days. They had a glut of rain up here 5 days out. So that this rainfall flowed down the Cedar River, combined with this rainfall right here, and hit Cedar Rapids on June 13th. And people say, well, why wasn't that flood predicted? Because nobody could have predicted that the rain fell just there, just that much the night before. So this is interesting stuff. It's not easy. It might look easy, but these are complex models, and you do a flood and a river at a time. It's still pretty tedious. I think that researchers hope that eventually this will all be on the web and people will have access so they can see what is going to flood when. Cedar Rapids peak, June 13th, 2008. Biggest flood on record, twice as big as any previous flood we've had. The second biggest flood was about 73,000 cubic feet per second. Here we had 140,000 cubic feet per second going through Cedar Rapids. Huge flood. So what do these floods do? Well, some of the things that they do are quite obvious. They cause a lot of damage, and that's pretty obvious, but not everything is so obvious. And that's what's a little bit scary to me about floods. Here you can see in Cedar Rapids, the white is the 9.2 square miles that was flooded on June 13th, 2008. Do you know what all these little black dots are? Anybody want to guess? Those are EPA toxic release sites. Those are sites that have been designated by the Environmental Protection Agency as sites that needed cleanup because of their toxic waste in the soil, in the water here in Cedar Lake. Excuse me, I'm going to go back. The thing that is scary to me about floods is exactly this. We don't know everything about them. We don't know what they're doing. We don't know everything about climate change. And one of the things, I've been doing a lot of reading and talking to people about climate change recently, and the thing that people say is, what is climate going to do? Climate change is going to do? It's not going to end the world. What it's going to do is increase uncertainty, which is something that people have a hard time dealing with. We want to know we're going to get up in the morning in September and have pleasant weather, right? And it feels like July out there. I'm not saying that this is climate change, but we have expectations about our world. We have expectations about the fact that we're not going to have, here Sarah's suffering from her allergies, and she doesn't want to be suffering from them in September. She wants the weather a little bit cooler. And if you have increased certainty, I think we're looking toward a period when that uncertainty is going to increase in many ways. And so in summary, let's look at floods. What do we can say that Iowa floods are complex. There's a heck of a lot more to learn. Each flood really requires a detailed analysis to understand why it happened, how all of these factors figured together to produce the flood. But that there are similar trends. We've seen them in 2008, we've seen them in 2010. And we should look at these trends and watch for them. And if we see these appearing, we should prepare for flooding. And that is a snowy winter with a wet, cool spring, saturated soils, rivers running full. We're set up at that point for having floods in the early summer because of this concentration of rainfall in the early summer. And we can say that we have contributors to the flooding: landscape alteration, changing climate. Another thing that we haven't talked about is simply that we put ourselves in harm's way. Why do we get harmed? You know, why do you get run over by the car? Because you're standing in the middle of the street, right? If you're standing on the sidewalk, you're not going to get run over. Why do we get so much damage from floods? Because we live in floodplains. And floodplains are structurally a part of the river's bed. So if you don't want to get wet, you don't live in the river's bed. That's the basic truth. How do we do that? How do we work toward a saner environment, toward an Iowa where we live with floods rather than pretending maybe that we won't get hit again? Well, the most obvious thing is that we need to get more permanent cover, permanent ground cover on agricultural areas. A landscape that is over half bare ground, waiting for early spring rains to erode it and to wash into the rivers, is setting ourselves up for floods. So moderate intensity flood is giving way to a more extreme flood, and we need to increase infiltration on agricultural land. We also need to increase infiltration in cities, and there are lots of things that are being done in cities now. And we need better policies in land management. I put these in because here's Idlewild, right? Built within the 100-year floodplain. Here is the Iowa River, here's Parkview Terrace, here's Idlewild right over here, here's the arts campus, here's my building right down here. We need to keep people and structures out of harm's way. And some cities are doing this. Cedar Falls passed legislation this year so that it's now illegal to build a structure in the 500-year floodplain. The 500-year floodplain is much bigger than the 100-year floodplain. And people were afraid to do it, and the city council said, why are we afraid to do it? You know, our job is to protect people from danger. We're telling them to stay out of the interstate. If you stand in the interstate, you're going to get hurt. If you live in the floodplain, you're going to get hurt. And so they now have legislation preventing any more construction there. And my passion, my love, my true love, is to talk about taking some of this agricultural land and giving it back to the natural ecosystems, to restore our land, return land's native species and ecosystem services at the same time. And that's something that we definitely need to do. A few other things that we can do. We can legislate for flood mitigation and better floodplain land use. And I put down the Rebuild Iowa office. I've gotten to know some of the people there recently. They're afraid because they're supposed to be out of a job in April. And they say, we're having all of this flooding now. Is Rebuild Iowa still going to be in operation or not? Their job is to give sample legislation, to recommend legislation to the legislature on how to cope with floods. This last year, they had very little of their sample legislation passed. And what was passed was really weakened down quite a bit. I'm wondering if this next year, after this past summer, if this next year there might be more receptivity to it, and if Rebuild Iowa office will stay in existence. Obviously, watershed-wide floodplain management, not just looking at each city, but looking at the whole floodplain. Agricultural policies are so important. And I just would invite you to consider on the ballot this fall, looking at the two candidates. One is pretty much a corn and soybeans farmer. The other one is a permanent cover or perennial cover person. Very different choices that we have for Secretary of Agriculture, which could really change the face of Iowa if we had somebody who was not so much in love with corn and soybeans. Conservation efforts, many of you have heard of the Iowa Water and Land Legacy. It's going to again be something on the ballot on November 1st, the first question. This would give permanent funding to Iowa for conservation efforts, including over half of the money would go to farmers for conservation, for buffer strips, for preventing flooding in their lands and the like. And communication among diverse groups. I put this in because this is very interesting to me. We have two different groups now in Iowa promoting two plans that are totally in opposition to each other. And they're both very well intentioned. The Iowa plan, has anybody here heard of the Iowa plan? Anybody? The Iowa plan is proposed by the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, and it's in a sample program now, in a testing program. The Iowa plan is going to allow farmers to renew their drainage tiles on the uplands in exchange for building large wetlands near a river's mouth. Many conservationists are concerned about the fact that we would be destroying little uplands, little watersheds farther up on the uplands in exchange for one big wetland down, am I saying this right? One big wetland farther down. They don't think it would work, basically. In contrast to that, we have people at my institute talking about distributed water storage as a way of preventing floods. And what they say is we need to construct little wetlands, little water storage areas way throughout the drainage. Hundreds, or dozens, maybe not hundreds, but at least dozens of little water storage areas throughout the uplands in order to hold the water so that it doesn't gush down into the rivers. Again, well-intentioned plans, totally different recommendations, people not putting those two together. So communication is a lot of the problem, I think, here, and some of the solution as well. And how do we address climate change? Well, 3 question marks there. If anybody can answer that, that's great. Go talk to our president. I read a quote recently that I just love. If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. And I think of us Midwesterners as being traditionalists. I'm a traditionalist. I like things to be the way they are. I want my kids to come home. I want my grandkids to come home to a state that is as welcoming and as beautiful as I think Iowa is. But if we want those amenities to last, if we still want swimming holes and bird song and all of these things that some of us love, things are going to have to change in a major way. We're going to have to accept that our comfort zone might be impeded upon by the actions that we might have to take to combat climate change. We're going to have to accept that the norm might have to switch. We're going to have to accept that we might have to change our standard of living if we want the more important things to stay the way they are.